Okay, so today's session is focused on a critical but often under-recognized form of oppression, linguistic racism. So we're drawing from the 2020 special issue of the International Journal of Bilingual Education and Bilingualism. So linguistic racism refers to how power is structured and reinforced through language, how certain ways of speaking are privileged while others are stigmatized or silenced. So this intersects directly with our work as future counselors, therapists, especially when we're working with clients from multilingual, immigrant, indigenous, or racially minoritized backgrounds. Linguistic racism includes both ideologies and daily practices that create and maintain unequal linguistic power. So it starts by targeting speakers for culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds as well as indigenous communities. And this form of racism is enacted through judgment about accent, dialect, grammar, or perceived quote unquote fluency, and often works subtly to police the boundaries of who is heard, respected, or dismissed. So the pandemic highlighted how quickly language and race can be weaponized. If you remember, it seems like a long time ago, but it wasn't really. We saw explicit racist graffiti on Asian homes, phrases like death to dog eaters or China virus. These are not isolated incidents, they reflect deeper linguistic ideologies that equate certain languages or accents with threat, disease, or inferiority. So it's critical to understand that language is not neutral, it's racialized. Linguistic stereotyping is often based on race and skin color. So, for example, international students may be judged not just for their English proficiency, but for how their speech reflects their ethnicity. So, this can lead to what Dochin calls accent bullying, where people are mocked or excluded because their English doesn't sound quote unquote standard. So, name calling, racial slurs, and even seemingly harmless quote unquote jokes can all be tools of linguistic racism. There's a dominant belief that one standardized language is normal. Deviations like code switching, non standard English, or accented speech are seen as deficient. So Dochin and others remind us that it's not just what is said, but who is listening. The white listening subject, as theorized by Flores and Rosa, determines whether speech is deemed acceptable. So even fluent multilingual speakers are sometimes still perceived as lacking because the listener expects deficiency. Despite formal diversity policies, many institutions globally are strongly monolingual. International students often feel invisible, while local students experience linguistic privilege. So this creates a quiet, persistent inequality. And as the counselors and therapists, we want to be attentive to how language shapes belonging in various spaces and how linguistic racism can produce deep emotional wounds. The impact is not just academic, it's very personal. So in this case, students experiencing linguistic racism report social withdrawal, fear of speaking, low self-esteem, and even suicidal thoughts. And Dochin describes this as an inferiority complex that erodes a person's confidence. So these are mental health issues. This is trauma, and they require a trauma-informed, culturally responsive counseling approach. In Spain, researchers documented how immigrant youth shared school stories filled with racial microaggressions. So these are small, everyday insults that over time produce lasting harm. They're often ratio-linguistic, meaning they blend assumptions about race with assumptions about language. And these youth learned quickly that even in multilingual regions, their speech marked them as other. For many Aboriginal Australians, not speaking standard English produces feelings of shame. Yet at the same time, speaking Aboriginal English fosters pride and connection. So the youth detention example, where a teen testifies that officers I'm sorry, mocked those who can't speak English properly underscores how institutional abuse often includes linguistic violence. Example comes from Dylan Voller, a young Aboriginal Australian who was incarcerated in a youth detention center in the Northern Territory. And in his testimony to the Royal Commission, he described not only physical abuse, but also linguistic abuse. Officers mocked and degraded young Aboriginal men because they couldn't speak English, quote unquote, properly. So Voller said, on a number of occasions, I've witnessed officers abusing young Aboriginal men in here and putting them down because they can't speak English properly. This moment is critical for us to reflect on. Language became a weapon used to strip dignity and reinforce racialized hierarchies in what was already a dehumanizing context. So these young people were criminalized not only for their actions, but also for their linguistic identity. It reminds us that linguistic racism isn't just about microaggressions or social discomfort. It can be tied to violence, systemic racism, and trauma. And as counselors, we need to recognize that linguistic shame can originate in institutions and have lasting psychological impacts. This story also highlights the urgent need for culturally and linguistically responsive interventions in correctional systems, schools, mental health settings, where, in this case, Aboriginal, but really other Indigenous youth are overrepresented. And we'll look at more about Indigenous issues later in the semester. So scholars use several frameworks to unpack linguistic racism. Skutnap-Kangas calls it linguicism, discrimination based on language. Flores and Rosa introduce ratiolinguistic ideologies, the idea that language and race are inseparable in how people are judged. Alim and others developed ratiolinguistics to challenge how power and language intersect. These theories help us name what our clients may feel but not have words for. This body of research is built on ethnographic studies, and if you have had me in other contexts, you may know I'm a big fan. So, real stories from real people, and it demands a critical perspective, looking beyond surface interactions to see how race, power, and language structure people's lives. And it calls for a holistic view, recognizing that linguistic practices are shaped by complex social contexts, including trauma, immigration, colonization, and systemic exclusion. Oh my gosh, it's our first class. This is a lot. So, what can we do? Okay, first, raise awareness. Name linguistic racism when we see it. Second, integrate translanguaging into educational and therapeutic spaces. This means honoring and using all of a person's languages. And third, building a culture of care. So, students, clients, and communities need to feel seen, heard, and supported in their full linguistic identities. So it's not enough to celebrate diversity in a shallow way. We must confront the constraints placed on bilingual speakers, especially those who are racialized. And this work is about social transformation, so challenging the hierarchies that privilege certain languages and silence others. So, as counselors, therapists, we are called to be agents of change, advocates for equity, and healers who recognize the deep wounds caused by linguistic injustice.